Welcome to the third and final episode of our pre-election special, talking all things presidential and I guess congressional election 2024. And to date, the first two episodes focused on the investing outcome. And this one will, of course, discuss the investing outcome as well and keep the investing lessons in close mind. However, I wanted to use this episode to look at what we're calling unknown unknowns of this presidential election, which takes place next week, Tuesday, November 5th. And my search for a guest led me to Mike Blyth, and he is kind enough to join us here on the Contrarian Investor podcast today. And Mike, to start off, perhaps just because your background isn't the typical one that we usually have on this show, I thought it would be interesting for you to tell listeners just about yourself, your background, and I guess your expertise in all things security.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, as you can tell by the funny accent, I'm originally from the UK, although I have lived in America for over 22 years now, and I'm a US citizen. I started in the Royal Marine Commandos. I was enlisted. There was a clerical error, and they promoted me to officer after about 3 or 4 years. And I left at 15 years as a major, during which time I commanded US military forces during 9/11, about 500 of them, spread across the Navy and the Air Force, one of which then became my wife, and I ended up with 5 kids, hence being in America.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And then I've worked in about 50 or 60 countries, developing training and various other strategies for various governments during my military career. Then I left. I went into the commercial security sector, leading some of the biggest projects in Iraq, including oil and gas infrastructure protection programs, worth about $2 billion, all across the country, developing police stations, prisons, border forts, and courthouses. And then I moved into the corporate side here in America, leading all US government contracts for a big security company, and then migrated into business development. And then I set up my own company, Risk and Strategic Management Corporation, about 14 years ago. During which time, I also got a master's degree in security risk management, a doctorate in organizational resiliency, and I wrote a couple of rather boring books on crisis security and emergency management through Wiley and Sons. And then my company was acquired 2.5 years ago by a group called Sigma 7, and I'm now the Chief Revenue Officer, where I support their 5 business practices, integrate and provide unified solutions for both domestic and international clients.
Wow. Okay. So your background your entire career has very much been focused on security, national security, be it, in Iraq, UK, and US. And who are your clients now, and in what capacity do you advise them, to the extent that you can tell us?
Yeah, so I've supported over 800 organizations spanning from government sectors destroying chemical weapons in Libya for DITRA, to US aid in various countries, supporting risk consulting and training services, and then into the commercial space, some of the big names in terms of oil and gas, IT, consulting and infrastructure development, and then also in terms of schoolings as well. So we do a lot of work with schools authorities in the US. So my perspective spans all of these sectors with few exceptions, both domestic resiliency, security, crisis management, but also internationally as well, projecting outwards. So I'm lucky to have quite a unique insight into how things happen in the United States and abroad, and then how they come together as well within a risk perspective.
Fantastic. Okay, so this is a perfect lead into the next question, which is, ahead of this election day and beyond, what are your concerns right now?
The US is facing a very different set of risks than it has in the past, both domestically and internationally. The risk of this election, regardless of your political leaning, is the danger of external actor influence, different government actors from hostile nations and or terrorist groups seeking to influence or distort the electoral process and seeking to excite people into potential violence and also cyber attacks. So we've got that external threat that's prevalent now. And then we've also got the internal discord in terms of there are two very polarized sets of the population sitting on either side. And rather than in the past where people, leant in one direction or another politically, but there wasn't any aggressive stance on either side, now there is a very polarized stance. The narrative of this being a spiritual or patriotic war or decision is concerning, because it means that people are very, very fixated on a win. And if it doesn't go their way, they feel that it could be the undoing of America in terms of, what America stands for, or indeed a good versus evil situation. And that is a serious concern in terms of aggravating violent outcomes. We've also got people feeling that violence is acceptable in order to reach a political outcome. And one of the concerning studies suggested that the acceptance of violence to reach a political outcome is higher now in America than it was in Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles in the 1970s.
Wow.
And that is a serious concern. And the spark that may fan the flames could come internally or externally. And we've already seen 2 attempted assassination attempts on the former president. We've seen, people articulating violence as a means to achieve the political outcome, or the willingness to engage in violent protests if the outcome isn't in their favor. And that should be concerning for Americans wholesale, and also for businesses as well.
Yeah, indeed. As you game this out, can you tell us about that process of gaming it out in terms of assessing where the risk is, I guess, to the economy and to civil society, and how that might all play out?
Absolutely. I did an academic study with over 70 senior security professionals. And what was concerning was that 91% felt that physical violence will occur. Certainly
91%.
91% of senior security professionals from some brand name organizations, I can't name them, obviously, sure, but you would recognize them, felt.
We're talking like just basic corporations or defense corporations?
Big corporations, some of them involved in security specific in terms of what they deliver. Some are, major pharmaceuticals or oil and gas companies or retail outlets. Some of them are articulated within the study, such as Apple and Anthropic. They were part of it. They were co-authors within the study. But 91% felt that violence would occur. Certainly if the candidate Trump is not elected, because of the sentiment that's going on. 93% felt that it would be premeditated. It wouldn't be spontaneous in nature. It would be planned. Somebody would actually go out with the intent to commit violence versus respond to a reactive situation. 59% felt that violence would include the use of firearms, which obviously amplifies the potential for harm in terms of injuries and deaths. And then 81% felt that violence would occur in multiple cities versus just being contained within the capital. So, we saw the violence within January 6th. They felt that would be expanded out into multiple urbanized areas as well, which would make it more of a challenge for populations and businesses.
Wow. Okay. And then how does that all game out, like in the days after, assuming, what does that look like in the scenarios?
Yeah. So, there is a protracted period of potential violence. So we got the pre-electoral process, where tensions may become heightened, and thankfully we've seen little in the way of violence now. Mm-hmm. We've then got the electoral vote, where the decision is then made, and that could spark violence depending on which way it goes. And then we've got the period leading up to the inauguration and then beyond. And so there are kind of calendar points within the process where we could see heightened violence. We can also look at it in terms of how crowds and groups mobilize in terms of the pre-mobilization, social media suggesting that there are rallies and demonstrations, the mobilization period itself where people gather, hopefully in a peaceful manner, but it can be aggravated by internal agitators who seek to promote violence. And then obviously the immediate hostile outburst phase, where we will see individuals or groups committing violence, and we saw them through various protests in the previous years here in America and abroad. Civil disorder violence and political violence isn't just in America. It happens globally as well. And then we see the post-hostile outburst phase where, things quiet down and then they're sparked again. Something aggravates the population or groups within it in order to generate more anxiety, fear, frustration, anger. And they can be predicted generally. The moment where violence occurs, it can be spontaneous, but the leading into violence is often, predictable in terms of social media, gatherings of crowds, sparks of violence occurring that then accelerate quite quickly.
Mm. Is there anything on that you started to see? I mean, yet?
The narrative is obviously causing elevated concern. So the narrative in itself, the precursor to the actual violence, is deeply concerning. And I think many would agree that it is quite hostile. It's quite negative. There are individuals insinuating or stating that violence should and could occur, and that is concerning. So really, it's a tinderbox. We're waiting for the flame to be lit and the fuse to be ignited, and that's a deep concern. And I know that there's a lot of businesses paying particular attention to what's going on. Certainly, if they are retail outlets sitting within the high street, or whether they're relying upon critical vendors and suppliers that may be affected by violent outcomes.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Is there any thought as far as the various candidates and if Trump loses versus if Harris loses, is there a greater concern on one side or the other?
Yeah, I mean, everything I do in terms of studies or reporting is apolitical, so I'm not in favor of one or the other.
Same. Yeah.
But the hard facts are that if Harris loses, there'll be a potential lot of disappointment, but probably not much in the way of violence. However, if Trump loses, there are groups that are obviously very, very emotionally tethered to his success, and there will be accusations that the electoral process was not fair, that it was stolen, and then that could ignite those who feel that this is a spiritual or patriotic risk to the country. And that is where we will probably see violence occurring.
Okay, that's not very encouraging.
No.
But okay. And just further gaming this out, is there a realistic concern that the U.S. could disintegrate into a Northern Ireland Troubles type of situation? Probably not a completely fair comparison because that was sectarian versus this, but what kind of historical precedent can you point us to, if any?
I think every country is vulnerable to civil discord or indeed civil war at the most extreme end of the spectrum. I don't think any country could escape that potential possibility. You would hope that America and other Western nations would be more resilient to that, based on the fact that we're democratic. People have better levels of education. There's less kind of internal fractions and terrorism or interstate and conflict and risks. But that is still a concern, and there could be a fracturing of society. Maybe not on a whole scale level, but certainly on a localized level. We have militias in America that could be mobilized in order to serve a particular agenda or political purpose. We have lone shooters or small groups who could activate violence. We saw, with the accusations of Haitians, eating pets, bomb threats and risks occurring against schools and other kind of government institutions, that could be amplified quite significantly. We've already seen fires being lit within mailing boxes and ballots, and the sense that there is an unfair electoral process could lead to sparks of violence. And at the worst extreme, which is highly unlikely, but certainly not off the table, it could lead into some level of kind of civil war. But I would suggest that that's relatively remote.
Right. Yeah. Okay. In terms of, just to turn things economically here, you mentioned retail being one possible obvious casualty, and what other, and supply chains. What, if you put on your investor hat, I know it's not really necessarily your thing, but what types of areas do you think might be safer from this type of stuff?
Safer. I think any business that is not located within urban areas, any business that is not relying heavily upon tenuous supply chains and vendors would be more resilient and robust. I would suggest IT-related companies may be a threat from cyber attacks,
Right.
hostile nation axis, seeking to disrupt business operations in order to further destabilize the economy. They could be at risk. Those most at risk would be sitting kind of within urbanized areas where they would be a prime target or a secondary target from violence. So if you're a shopping outlet and you're selling TVs and other things that would be attractive to rioters, then I would be concerned. Or if you're relying upon others to provide you assets, materials, and so forth, you could be caught up in the after effects of violence as well.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this all being easy or relatively straightforward to spot in advance. Can you talk to us about if you can't, that's fine, but what kind of warning signals you might see on social media? Is it obvious stuff like, hey, let's attack X and things like that, or is there other more underlying signals that we might not be aware of?
In terms of social media, I mean, the trick is obviously being able to filter out all of the fluff, the irrelevancies, and identify the real triggers for potential violence. So, for the average citizen, watching reliable news sources versus ones that lead in one direction or the other would be useful. Identifying hotspots of potential violence outbreaks, and there obviously would be in the swing states as an example, and or other areas where people are becoming agitated about the situation and the outcome. So I would keep a keen eye on the news, and certainly reliable news that isn't trying to conflate or mislead.
But that's the news that people listen to nowadays.
Well, that's the trouble. Society seems to have split into two different, news lines. One leans heavily on one side, one leans incredibly heavily on the other as well, and therefore they're not necessarily getting an accurate picture on the situation. So I would try and find more unbiased news outlets, and sadly, they may be internationally based versus American based, because they don't necessarily lean in one particular direction or another from the political influence. So I would maybe watch those as well with some level of interest. The challenge will be where there are external actors who are using gaming in order to communicate terrorist attacks or other encrypted means where you may not be able to necessarily predict where they're going to focus on, but you can assume that they will be focusing on large crowd gatherings, or government buildings, or political offices, or prominent people. And so those kind of targets will be obvious, but which targets they choose and when may be less obvious.
Yeah, wow, okay. Yeah, talking about these external actors, while I have you here, geopolitically, how real is the U.S.-China Cold War type of thing? Is China one of these external actors? Is Russia? And where do you see geopolitical risks also if there is a change in administration here?
Well, I mean, in terms of those who may try and cause problems, Russia, North Korea, Iran, China to some extent. These individuals don't want a stable America. Well, obviously, we're funding military campaigns that are directly harming them. So anything they can do to destabilize America is in their interest. So I think we should be very conscious of how they may want to influence things. How the electoral process then influences the geopolitical landscape after the elections is going to be very interesting. Are we going to be withdrawing funds from Ukraine, Israel, and so forth? Is that going to further stabilize or destabilize the world? That's certainly a very interesting and complicated situation. And of course, the question also is the incumbent or the new incumbent going to be able to make those changes quickly, or is it going to be a slow, laborious process that kind of equalizes out the risk over a long period versus causing a transformative change within the risk landscape?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. There's a lot of stuff here, Mike Blyth, that you have discussed with us. What would you say is your number one concern here right now as we record this on October 30th, 2024?
My number one concern wouldn't necessarily be immediately post-election. It would be leading up to the inauguration if the wrong candidate was selected from those who may be the perpetrators of violence, because there would be some kind of planning phase going on in order to oppose the new elected official. So I'd be very, very concerned. I would be mindful of urbanized areas, certainly within the swing states. I'd be keeping a keen eye on that. And if I was a business owner, or indeed just the average citizen, I would be making some contingency plans to say, if as a business, if I saw some of the triggers being activated, how would I make myself and my people more resilient? So I'd be looking at protecting my people, protecting my facilities, my assets, my operation, my information, my reputation, and building up contingency factors to implement just-in-time training or predictive training for people, whether they're individuals who may work or move through areas of violence or potential violence. So I'd be looking to look after those. I'll be looking at vulnerable populations such as females, members of the LGBTQI community who may be singled out, or ethnic groups who may be singled out. I'll be looking at developing training programs and exercising programs for my management teams at the site level so that they are rehearsed and ready to react in a consistent and educated manner to a potential emergent or occurring threat. And I'll be looking at developing competency within my executive team as well, because they're the decision makers who are going to shape how the organization plans for a response to a potential threat. I'd be dusting off my policies and plans so that my business continuity and crisis and emergency management plans were up to date, were distributed and were effective. And I'd be assigning the right resources to address risks, whether they were internally based or engaging external experts to help augment my team. And then I'll be tracking things on a real-time basis, certainly up to and past the inauguration point. And that's what I would be doing as a company. As an individual, I'd be discussing with my family and my friends, what the triggers were for me as a person or as a family, and then identifying what I would do if violence broke out within my neighborhood or area. How would I react? What would I do? Would I relocate to a safe area with a family friend or family member in order to get my kids and my loved ones out of danger? So I'd be kind of tracking at the individual level as well.
So you mentioned swing states and urban areas, and is it correct that would you say those are the kind of the focal points now? And would this be as part of like a certification process for the votes or something like that this would play out?
Yeah, well, I mean, the swing states are because they're kind of the decider within the current electoral model of which way it goes. But I would also look at the states that are very, very blue or very, very red, because they're going to be upset if it goes in one direction or another more than the others. So that's why I think you can accurately predict the hotspots at the state level. At the localized level, or you would then look at major cities, because that's where crowds will gather. Apart from isolated lone shooters, working in small towns and villages, it's going to be the public protests where you've got 10,000 people marching down the street who are terribly upset, who then may turn aggressive. There may be a police response that aggravates the situation or is perceived to aggravate the situation. You can have individuals who are purposely placed within the crowd who then cause violence. A shooter on the rooftop, somebody chanting or pushing or stabbing, who then cause the rest of the crowd to become embroiled in violence. And having worked in over 50 countries, I've seen crowds turn within seconds. And you'd be amazed at what the average human being might do if they're called up in the crowd mentality. It's quite concerning. So it doesn't take much to push the normal, average, decent person over the edge to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do.
Yeah, gosh. But this again, but it doesn't sound like Washington, D.C. is necessarily much of a focal point. Is that because of the lessons learned from January 6th and that there would be more precaution this time around, or just not?
I would hope that the government are thinking about measures to identify perpetrators coming into the city, or to pre-position policing authorities in the right spot in order to control any potential or real violence. But I don't think, it will be kind of the focal point because that's where the inauguration will occur. But I don't think it will be the only spot where violence will occur, because there will be time between the votes being counted and the new president signing in for people to plan public protests across America. And there will also be time for agitators, whether domestic or international, to plan discord and violence during that period as well. And so that is potentially a planning phase for hostile actors to get things into place. Hopefully the FBI and other intelligence agencies are obviously tracking that and intercepting some or all of it, but it's a big job for them to tackle. And as we saw with the first attempted assassination on Trump, the individual who perpetrated that wasn't on their target list,
Right.
and therefore was a surprise to them. So,
yeah. All right. Last question to put things overall. If you just had to put it in percentage terms, the chances of violence, of any violence, I guess, occurring between now and the inauguration, and then with the chances of more widespread, how would you place that?
If and again, I'm apolitical, so I'm not suggesting any candidate is any better than the other. But if Harris is voted in, I think the potential for violence is exceptionally high. Whether it's isolated, sporadic, limited, or more widespread, I think the potential for incidents of violence is particularly high.
Like 80%, 70%?
80, 90%.
Wow.
That's if Harris is voted in. If Trump is voted in, I think it goes down to 10%.
Okay.
Because there's not been any indicators, certainly in research and so forth, that those who support Harris are inclined more towards violence, or feel as strongly from a spiritual or patriotic standpoint that it's going to be the end of America. They may feel it's going to be the end of democracy, but they don't necessarily have such passion about, or violent passion about, the potential outcomes. And I think that's what's going to cause the violence.
Even though there were 2 assassination attempts, granted, like you said, they were lone actors that we know of, but yeah.
And one might argue that the first individual was a registered Republican, so that wasn't perhaps politically motivated. It may just be a lone lunatic who. Sure. That was the target that came closest to them, and therefore they took a shot. I don't necessarily think that was a politically motivated attack. I'm not so certain about the second one. But when it becomes politically motivated violence, where people are going after groups or individuals, that's the concern.
Wow. Okay, Mike Blyth, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule this morning to speak with us. In closing, excuse me, maybe you can tell our listeners how they can find out more about you, your books, if you are on the social media or anywhere else, websites and things like that. And I will include that all that information in the show notes as well.
Yeah. Please get in touch. More than happy to share any information. We're providing certainly to organizations free resources, because we appreciate that there's some serious and complex risks occurring. So get in touch to our website, and I'll provide that as part of this briefing, and we'd be happy to help you out as much as we can.
And what's the website?
Sigma7risk.com.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time again. I really appreciate it. Fascinating conversation, if disconcerting. Thank you all for listening, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with our regularly scheduled programming, hopefully. And with that, I thank you once again and sign off for now. Bye.